All right, welcome back everybody to another edition of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. If you're tuning in for the first time, I'm Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Vanderbilt University, and I co-host this colloquium with Chelsea Estancona, who's an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. So we are an online speaker series that's affiliated with the Peace Science Society. We're founded in 2015 by Emily Ritter, and our goal is to celebrate the excellent research that happens, within the peace science community all year long outside of the annual meeting, which is in 2 weeks in Denver. I hope to see a lot of you there. So today we have a really cool paper entitled "Is Terrorism Necessarily Violent? Public Perceptions of Nonviolence and Terrorism in Conflict Settings" by Alon, Yakter, and Avishay bin Sasson-Gordis. We have two wonderful discussants. So first we have Daniel Arnon, who's an assistant professor in the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. Daniel is an expert in political violence, terrorism, human rights violations. We also have my Vanderbilt colleague, Noam Lupu, who's an associate professor. Noam is an expert in many things, but among them, the legacies of political violence and survey methods. And so I'm really excited to see the presentation and have a nice discussion afterwards. So with that, Alon, I'll turn the floor over to you. We'll have a 15 or so minute presentation, and then we'll move on to some discussant comments.
Great. So thank you for the introduction, Brad, and thank you for this great opportunity, especially across time zones and continents. So this is a really fun thing to do. And I'll present a paper together with Avishay, who's also here. And our project essentially starts with there's a bunch of research on terrorism being conducted, and we use these formal definitions. And there's also a lot of colloquial uses of the term as well that assume actual or threatened violence as inherent to the term. And it kind of and it means that nonviolence is excluded from the discussion in many ways. And that what piqued our interest in this was the fact that we saw a lot of examples of uses of the term terrorism against nonviolence actions. For example, the Israeli president, who's a fairly formal and moderate figure, called Ben & Jerry's boycott of selling ice cream in the territories a form of economic terrorism. But it's not just an Israeli story. We saw that in the US, litigation terrorism, one example against Missouri Attorney General. We saw that in Russia, information terrorism. We saw in Canada, people who blockaded a road because of COVID were blamed for economic terrorism. In cultural terrorism for tearing down statues. We saw it really much more commonly and often than we expected. So the elites use this term for pretty obvious reasons. It's a way to delegitimize whatever their rivals are doing. What we were wondering, however, is are regular people biting? Are regular people willing to accept the such strictly nonviolent actions as a form of terrorism? And in doing so, we're trying to join a growing literature that started. There's a seminal paper by Huff and Kurtzer in 2018, for example, to try to say, okay, we have our formal definitions, but how do regular people perceive actions? And how do they classify actions as terrorism or not? Which actions they classify too? This discussion, however, is mostly focused on different types of violent actions. So what we see rising from that discussion is that people do tend to follow formal definitions. It is about the type and severity of violence. Political motivation matters a lot, but it sometimes deviates, and it deviates because of group identities, both of the perpetrators, so who the perpetrators are matters, and both the target audiences, so what is my group identity, what are my political views when I judge these actions. So otherwise identical actions can be seen as in varying degrees as forms of terrorism based on these additional factors. So adding to this literature, some more recent work, some of it by Daniel, who's here as well, I started to look also at nonviolent protests in places like Israel, like the US, with the Black Lives Matter, Antifa discussion that's been going on too, and saw that some nonviolent mass protests can also be seen as violent and even justify state repression just as violence and terrorism for that matter. And what they emphasize is it really matters it really hinges on the negative stereotypes, the way we perceive the people who march in the street. If we think they're violent, we tend to see their nonviolent action as a form of violence. And this is a really important development because it shows us that this strict separation of violence and nonviolence is not that strict in people's minds. However, the limitation of these studies is that mass protests, we have to admit, have a really strong physical aspect to it. When we see a mass of people marching and shouting and contesting, it is somewhat physically threatening, or it's very easily construed as such. We were wondering about the ice cream boycotts, though. Can we look at strictly nonviolent action or different types of nonviolent actions and judge them at some forms of terrorism and not, again, these strict separations or exclusion that we see in our formal definitions. So our argument is pretty straightforward in that regard. We argue that this is a spectrum. It's not a dichotomy as these definitions imply in people's minds. So in public perceptions, especially in active conflicts, doesn't have to be necessarily deeply salient, violent conflict, but some form of intergroup conflict that involves a lot of group identities and strong emotions. We think that a similar logic should also apply to nonviolent actions on this spectrum. So we try to unpack this logic. We do so using pre-registered hypothesis. And we have a few. So one of them, we do think that violence is a criterion. In that, we're not that counterintuitive. We think most people do see the difference between violent and nonviolent actions, but we see it as a spectrum. We think it's probably more likely, violent actions would seem more strongly as terrorism than nonviolent action. It doesn't necessarily mean complete exclusion. But we also want to emphasize the degree of harm as another more soft criterion. So sure, there's physical violence, the physical harm of violence, but then there's a bunch of types of non-physical harm. We can hurt people's economic situation. We can harm their group status. We can do a bunch of non-physical harm. And then there's also forms of zero-sum harm, which is a title we refer to anything the other group does in a zero-sum setting might seem to us like an attack on us. For example, when there's limited resources and they gain something, we can think that that's aimed at taking something from us. So we think there's probably a hierarchy with physical harm on the top, but it's a spectrum. It doesn't necessarily involve 0 and 1. We think labeling should matter. So we started with these labels. That's what, again, piqued our curiosity about this phenomenon. So we think that if elites call a certain nonviolent action terrorism, some people at least might stop and say, you know what, maybe it is a form of terrorism. And we think there's probably a strong ideological heterogeneity, ideological heterogeneity around these effects. So first, we think that right-wing individuals, by that we mean conservative, hawkish, people who tend to, by theory, be more sensitive to group threat, would probably all else equal rank nonviolent action closer to violence in how close they are to being terrorism. And when it comes to the labeling effect, we pre-registered two competing hypotheses because there's two logics here. One is that labeling would work more strongly on right-wingers because they're more susceptible to that, so a propensity effect, we'll call that. But the other option is that there's a ceiling effect, that right-wingers are already so judgmental of these actions that it's the other side, the doves, that might reconsider their position and have more room to change their minds. So we think it might be the left-wingers, it might be the right-wingers, two opposite logics that we want to test. So we're going to do that. We're doing that with a pre-registered survey experiment in Israel. In the paper, we discuss why Israel is a good case. I won't go into that here, but I will say it is about hypothesis testing. So we looked for a case that's going to be very, where everything is really salient and visible. We're using a politically representative sample of the Jewish population, the one that's in greatest contestation with the Palestinians. And our treatment is pretty straightforward. We showed people a sentence describing an action, and then we asked what they think about this action. So we have two manipulations in this sentence. The first is which action, which type of action by the Palestinians. And here we try to portray a spectrum. So our baseline or control, in a sense, is just strict violence, the classic terrorism, Palestinian attempts to kill and injure Israeli citizens. That's the textbook definition. Then we have two forms of non-physically harmful actions. One is stronger. It's economic sanctions. It's supposed to hurt more people in terms of their economic situation, hurt the economy. The second is more limited. It's about petitions against Israel to the International Court at The Hague. It's not aimed specifically at people. It does aim at the group, at status, at the national group. So it's slightly weaker, but it's still a non-physical harm against the in-group. And then to stretch it out and try to look for zero-sum harm examples, that's a real example we found by an extreme rightist Israeli politician, illegal construction. So an attempt of Palestinians to build illegally homes for themselves in contested territories, which may seem to some people as attempts to take territories that Jews could have built houses in, or contested territories. But there's no direct harm against anyone. It's just homes for themselves. So we can both look at these as four different types of actions, and we can also look at them bundled. So in case there's no gradient here, we can also look at violence against all these. We're going to pull all three and look at all of them as nonviolence, and then both break them down at the same time in a different model. The second manipulation manipulate the label. So each sentence is presented in one of two forms: a no label, which is Israeli leaders recently condemned, and then one of these actions that we saw above. The label condition says Israeli leaders recently condemned the Palestinian economic, legal, construction terrorism accordingly, expressed in, and then we mentioned the action in parentheses. So the action is still mentioned, but the emphasis is on the type of action. It's on the label, sorry. And the outcome is a bit tricky because we want to see whether people are seeing this as terrorism, but we can call something terrorism just as a hyperbole because we don't like the action, as a symbolic hyperbole. So to try to break it down, we look at three outcomes. We ask people whether they agree that this action establishes terrorism. This is a straightforward denotation question. And then we break down the symbolic and substantive aspects by asking the symbolic aspect. We just ask them, do you think this action is illegitimate? If this is where most of the effect is concentrated, this is a symbolic hyperbole, probably. But we also ask them about repression. We ask them if they think this action justify use of force to prevent. And we explicitly say using Mossad and Shin Bet and IDF. We mention anti-terrorist agencies to make sure that this is as comparable as possible in substantive policy terms. So if most of the effect is concentrated here, people probably see this as terrorism, and something needs to be handled just as regular terrorist actions. It's a pretty clean analysis. We only add two more covariates. We interact with ideology in some of the models based on voting, right, center, or left blocks based on ideology on the conflict, the party ideology. And then we control for attention check. Additional controls as robustness doesn't matter much as expected. So looking at the results, first, for each outcome, we have a model with all nonviolent actions pulled together and then broken down. And what we see is that, as expected, the violence condition, the intercept, the baseline condition ranks 8 out of 10 on all outcomes. What we see is that, and as expected, nonviolence is ranked lower. It's denoted on all these three outcomes, anywhere between 0.3 to 0.8. So on the one hand, that shows the hypothesis. On the other hand, we were surprised by how high it is in absolute terms. It means most of the actions is between 6 and 8. That's very high. That's on the top part of the scale. It means that Palestinian actions are not, there's no clear distinction of 1 and 10 as we may have expected on paper. I won't go into the breakdown by action for lack of time. I will say that sometimes it works, sometimes not. Here we see a clear hierarchy, in others not. We need more research into the reasoning between the differentiation. But I want to show the partisan heterogeneity because it's extremely strong. When we break down the difference between violence and nonviolence for each of these outcomes by right, center, and left respondents, right-wingers see all of them almost identically. Everything the Palestinians do for right-wingers in Israel is akin to terrorism, essentially, and justifies repression. Left-wingers are much lower, but they're still, the dashed lines show the mid-scale point. They're still not far from the mid-scale point. Centrists are somewhere in between, but slightly leaning to the right. What about labeling? So labeling does have an effect, but it's very weak. So denotation, it is significant. Most of the effect is on the substantive aspect. This is 0.1 in terms of significance. We can p-hack it very easily into 0.05, but we don't, it's 0.3 out of 1 on a 1 to 10 scale. So it doesn't matter. It's still very weak. What we do see, though, is that it's a lot of the story here is partisan heterogeneity. So we pre-registered it might be the left-wingers, it might be the right-wingers. We were surprised by our result. It's surprising and makes a lot of sense at the same time. It's the centrists. It's the people who aren't resolute in their ideological position who are mostly swayed by these labels. And this is a 1-point difference. This is significant, and it means that hawks can make swing audiences move in their direction through these labels. This is very meaningful, even though it's limited in a sense. I won't go into, in the paper, we look into mechanisms a bit through textual analysis of open questions. I do want to say very briefly, we wonder whether this is just, what's the role of salience? Is this just an Israeli story? So we replicated this using a convenience sample in the US. We asked about Iran instead of the Palestinians. Iran is a state. It's not exactly a terrorist organization, but some of its arms are in the US terrorist list. So it's linked with terrorism. Low salience conflict, we'll call it. The same manipulations, mild adjustment instead of illegal construction. We talk about sanction bypass, but just to make it more plausible. And what we find is that the same relations do replicate. The one difference is the absolute scores. So very briefly, this is the partisan difference in Israel. It's very high. This is the partisan difference in the US. It's in the lower part of the scale, but still conservatives see nonviolent actions by Iran as around the mid scale. Also in terms of repression. The second part, and the labeling works the same too. We see that the labeling effect works on American independents. It doesn't work on liberals or conservatives. It works on independents. This is it's a smaller sample, but it's still significant in if we depending on the model. But it shows that the relations replicate. The salience matter for absolute scores only. So just to conclude, what we're trying to argue here is that the discussion is unnecessarily limited to only violent actions, or at least seemingly violent demonstration. Perceptions of terrorism are much more fluid. They can extend to nonviolent action. It depends on the degree of violence and harm, but also depends on ideological predispositions very strongly, and labeling mostly for swing audiences. And that has a lot of implications. We discussed them in the paper. I won't do it now for lack of time. I will say one, though, because that's the most concerning for us. And the fact that people discuss nonviolence as something that has added benefits. If there's a chilling effect, if we can take nonviolent campaigns and portray them and repress them as if they're violent, as if they're terrorism, our concern is that the contesting side would look at that and say, you know what, I might as well use violence. There's no point. I might as well be violent. I'll get all the benefits of violence without while being treated the same. So I'll end here, and I'm looking forward to, there's a bunch of things you can unpack here later. So looking forward to the comments, and thank you again.
Alon, thank you very much for the presentation. So before we turn it over to our discussants, I'll have the two of you, if you wouldn't mind taking just like a few minutes and kind of like framing the paper, like tell us where you're at with it, what you're hoping to get out of the discussion. You know, for example, is this something that you're looking to send out in the next, in the very short term, or is this something that you're sort of more, actively like working on? Is it a part of a bigger project? Just kind of frame the paper for us in that sense before we go into the discussion.
So I'll start, but Avishay, feel free to of course, join in at any point. So the paper is more finished than it was when we first applied to the workshop, and I think when we applied, I don't remember if we even added the American data yet. And at this point, it's already, we actually submitted it, but for first run, we're kind of assuming, as always, that it's going to come back for additional reiteration, just statistically. So our point right now is in trying to think both short. So on what we don't want, I guess, what would be least useful is suggestions on bettering the design, because we're past that point. We got a lot of comments like that. It's always frustrating at this point. So we're looking a lot at framing. We're looking a lot at trying to think whether we're emphasizing the right thing, whether it's convincing, whether we have pre-registered analysis, which is limiting in a sense, in a good sense. So we don't look to play games on rephrasing what our expectations were, but I think we're still looking for a lot on framing, on again on what we can emphasize more, what can emphasize less. But having said all that, we're still wondering about follow-up data collection. We can still consider that. We can run a better analysis of a better collection of a better US sample, a higher quality one. We can think of rerunning this with Israeli audiences again in some form. So we're not looking into that necessarily. That's going to cost time and resources. But we are looking for thoughts on that, if that's making a better case, helping to elevate this into a better position. But I will say this is a first cut at the full paper, so anything that would allow us to make this better is much needed. And Avishay, feel free to join in if you have any added.
Yeah, so Alon covered most of it. I will just add that one thing I think is always useful is to hear what struck you about either the paper or the presentation. What is it that you went into this expecting one thing, hearing another, or kind of reinforced intuitions that you had dormant, but are now feeling more comfortable, or you would like to share? You're leaving this talk and you're talking to someone and you say, we heard this, cool paper, but what struck you about it as something that is shareable, so we can know maybe either to lean into it in this paper or in the follow-up moves that we do in the future.
Great. Thank you both. So I'll turn it over to Daniel. And so just to kind of structure the discussion, I've asked Daniel and Noam to each take 10 minutes or so. If it takes less time, that's fine. To sort of get all your comments out there. Then we'll have a response, and then we'll use the remaining time to have an open discussion. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So first of all, congratulations, guys. This is a great paper, and reading it now after seeing the presentation at APSA kind of really makes it stick a little bit more. And so the comments that I have for you today are going to be divided into I'll start off with what Avishay asked, a little bit of what struck me and what I think is neat about the paper. And then I'll kind of give you some thoughts on a little bit on the research design and how I would proceed with the paper, and take it or leave it if you want to do what I say. But so first of all, the paper is great. I think that it's it's addressing a gap in the literature that's very clear and needed. I think that there's a lot of room to keep pursuing these kinds of things. And I think that the two things that really stood out to me in terms of the paper is first, on the conceptual side, I really like the hierarchies that you guys created within the nonviolent actions, and trying to get at the mechanism through the idea of harm and what is more harm and less harm through the a zero-sum formulation of that. And so within the nonviolent actions, I like the attempt to kind of decipher what is going on there. Is the first one. And the second one that strikes me as the most important, and where I would center the entire paper around, really is the finding on the elite labeling side of the experiment, and the fact that it works for centrists, because that's policy relevant, and so I think that can get through in a way that doesn't work for other components of the paper. But it cuts across really easily. It's intuitive. It's very clear to understand it, right? And the fact that it's a non-finding that turns out to be a finding once you look at the heterogeneous effects kind of gives a little bit of a no duh, oh cool, oh good, that's a really neat way to kind of frame it. And so going back to the question of where I would center the paper around, I would make that much more central to the paper. I think that on the framing side of the paper, you guys do a great job in the intro of talking to contentious politics lit people. I think that you could also benefit from getting a little bit more of the securitization folks into the discussion, talking about the post 9/11 securitization of terrorism, what that means, and how numb we've become to the term and the definitions, and so it's expanded in its use in an attempt, like give a little bit more of the story of why it would make sense that these usages of terrorism as an elite labeling exercise may work, right? The expansion of the role of terrorism in our lives in a post 9/11 more securitized world, and like if you put a little bit more of that in the intro alongside the contentious politics side of things, it'll be like it'll broaden it up a little bit and place it a little bit better for the reader, in my mind at least. So that's the big picture kind of stuff is really there. I think that and this is a comment that I made to you, Alon, also, but I'll say it again. I think that one of the things that that would concern me, at least as a reviewer, is the 1 to 10 scale on the definition of terrorism. I was trying to think really hard about making a bit more of a helpful, and I don't know if this is methodologically a good thing to do, but what you could do to see that it's not like artificial variation because you gave a 10-point score is just divide the score in 2 and round it and put it on a 1 to 5 scale, not like in the absolute division of it, but like round it up. So if somebody answered like a 3, then make that into a 2 or some kind of mechanism. No, that's not really going to work. No, that's not going to work. That's a bad comment. Sorry, but some kind of way to shrink a little bit of the artificial variation, that would be a concern of mine as a reader in the context of this. What else did I have? Sorry, now I need to go into my notes and. Oh, the other thing that on the writing side of things, I'm starting to get a little bit more into the weeds of it. But in terms of the writing of the research design section, there's a bit of an issue with flow. I'll just give you the written comments for that side of it. Yeah, I like the mechanism testing that you do with the text analysis. I think that there's a lot of information in there that's up for grabs, and I think that it's nothing fancy, but it really kind of elucidates a lot of what you're trying to describe. I think overall that's really the gist of it. I think that the framing just could be a little bit bigger than where you're putting it right now, and I think that throwing in a little bit of the securitization context and conversation might make it a little bit bigger, and reframe the paper a little bit more around hypothesis 1B and 2, and then in terms of how to move forward with the paper. My suggestion would be, and again, I'm not sure that you want to really do this, but my suggestion would be that slim it down and turn it into a note. I think that as a note, this has if you want a faster route to get to publication and it's something that you want to get relatively quickly, I think that trying to sell this as a full paper is going to be harder than selling it as a note. And I think that if you slim it down and focus specifically on the elite labeling side of the experiment and bring it down into just cut through, get straight to the chase, show the results, and do that, that would be in terms of getting it out as fast as possible, that's the route that I would go. But if you want to sell it as a full paper, then I would definitely replicate the US experiment and do it on a bigger sample, a less of a convenient sample, and finding a better actor than Iran. I think that if you just said the IRGC or some kind of non-state actor that can pose some kind of threat, it's hard to find exactly one that'll have all the parallels, I know, but I think that just from a reviewer perspective, somebody is going to be in the pool that's going to say, I don't buy it because of that. But that's it. I'll send you guys the written comments. They have a little bit more specificity about some of the research design write-up and helping a little bit with the flow, but that's really it. I think that the paper is really great in the fact that it has exactly that. It has that one finding that really sticks, that's policy relevant, that can sell really well. but I think that the easiest way for you guys to sell it is to center the entire paper around that finding, for me at least, and then selling it as a note would be probably the fastest way to get it out, if that's where you're trying to go. But that's it for me. Thanks for letting me read the paper. It was really fun.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you
Noam,
for
if
reading
wanna
it.
jump in.
Did you call on me, Brad? I didn't hear you. Okay.
Yes, I think I failed to unmute myself, but
Okay.
Noam.
Thanks. Well, thanks for the invitation to do this. It was a fun paper to read. I think I have sort of 4 comments, but let me start with Avishai's question and sort of echo some of the things that Daniel said. 2 things I really like about the paper. One is sort of this effort to unpack violent and nonviolent actions, rather than sort of treating them as a dichotomy. Yeah, certainly in terms of public, the way that the public internalizes them, I think is really important. And actually, this is going to lead to my sort of first comment about things I would revise. The other thing I really like, and this echoes Daniel's, is the effect of the label on the centrists. And so, like him, I think that's a nice contribution. So my first comment has to do with framing, and so I think the current paper is sort of framed. You sort of start the paper with this piece on terrorism, and then we get into sort of, well, what if we? In fact, this was how you presented it too, right? And what if we get into sort of nonviolent and violent? I would do the opposite. I would start with, we can actually unpack these things, and it's not obvious that the public sees these things as dichotomous in the way that we treat them analytically, violent and nonviolent actions by groups. And let's take an example of what that might look like, and let's use terrorism. There's some recent literature on this, perceptions of terrorism, and that seems to me like a bigger framing and a sort of a bigger contribution, where the terrorism piece is a sort of an entry point, a sort of a design kind of decision rather than a theoretical motivation. You're still speaking to that, literature, but it seems like a narrower piece of the broader contribution. Then I guess I have sort of a kind of a theoretical question about that piece on terrorism, and I'm not sort of familiar with that that literature or sort of Josh's work on this, but I guess I wanted to know a little bit more about what's at stake in perceptions of terrorism. To me, at some point in the paper, I sort of started thinking this is a lot like how American politicians on the right use the term socialism and American politicians on the left use the term fascism. And so aren't we really just talking about smears, or something like that? And do we really need to know what Americans' perceptions of actual socialism and fascism are? Does that do theoretical work, or is it really ultimately this is a sort of a paper about framing, about the effects of framing something as terrorism, or framing a candidate as a socialist, or framing a movement as fascist, something like that. I think the results still hold, but it's a slightly different way of thinking about what you're doing, and also sort of an opportunity to bring in some of the literature on framing. And then that result on sort of when you frame things, certain behavior as terrorism, these are the kinds of people that sort of end up changing their evaluations of that behavior. So I guess an opportunity for you to say more about that, but also sort of potentially a slightly different way of framing the theory and the contribution. Getting a little bit more towards what is the experiment actually doing. One concern that I have is so you could think about this as framing, right? You're putting a frame on a set of information that somebody has that you're giving your subjects. That information is this petitions or boycott or whatever. That's the information. The terrorism is just a frame, a sort of label, a smear, whatever you want to call it. I guess another possible way to interpret what's going on is that label is actually information. So Israeli leaders are sort of suggesting that this is actually more severe this has more sort of serious consequences than you might think if I just told you that they were boycotting, whatever. And that's a little bit different, right? That result actually means that, people are sort of updating how severe this behavior is because you're sort of attaching that label to it. So, what do we do about this? And this is going to get to sort of my kind of suggestion, how to move forward. I sort of see this, obviously if it or wherever you sent it, then go for it. But one possibility, and I guess I'm going to sort of go in a different direction than Daniel, unless you're sort of in big rush to publish this. My suggestion would go in the direction of sort of study 1, study 2, study 3, a kind of thing that you see in sort of public opinion or political psychology kind of work, where you did this first thing and then you were concerned about a couple of things, so you did another study, right? Maybe in the U.S. And then maybe or use the sort of convenience sample in the U.S. and then you were concerned about another thing, right? This severity issue, maybe the sample and the Iran salience issue that Daniel raised. So you did another one, right? And then you have a sort of a more robust paper that has keeps all of those things in there. You're not replacing, but you're sort of giving sort of more flesh to it. So that's the direction I would go. Obviously, unless it just works the way as written, then great. Two final things. I wondered, so you bring up civil rights sort of towards the end of the paper, and with a quote from MLK, and I wonder about how nonviolent actions. You mentioned this in the presentation, actually, although I don't think I saw it in the paper. Nonviolent actions by otherwise, potentially violent or stereotypically violent actor might be perceived differently than nonviolent actions being pursued by an otherwise sort of considered stereotypically sort of considered nonviolent actor, where sort of I would put sort of MLK in that category. So is there something different, and in fact could you test that in a kind of follow-up study where the evaluations of these things, the responses to these things are going to be different depending on the mix of behaviors that this group is engaging in? Again, I think that would speak to the problems with the way that we dichotomize violent and nonviolent behavior, because often factions of the same group are engaging in violence and nonviolence, and so it's easy to see why the public would sort of respond to these things in not so clear-cut ways, whereas we sort of analytically distinguish them because the groups associated with them are actually doing a bunch of different things. So that would be something sort of that I think would be really neat to explore, and I think you have sort of a design that would allow you to do that. if you did a survey in the, sort of a general population survey in the US and you kind of replicated this, you could do Iran and you could do something else, and you could sort of vary not just the salience, but also, whether the actor is otherwise considered violent or not. That's something you could even measure, right? And sort of give us some data that that's actually the way that people perceived it. All right, I will stop there. But thanks again.
Thank you, Noam. So before we turn it over to the presenters, I had one, so this is sort of outside of my area of expertise, but I did have one comment, and it was very similar to something that Noam brought up. So the thing that I found most interesting about the results was the reaction of centrists, right, to this kind of cue. And so I had almost exactly the same reaction to Noam, which is that I was curious about whether this was framing or providing information, right? And so and so it's sort of thinking about it, taking this like external validity of the study. One thing I'm curious about is, especially if you were to follow on with this, I think you could consider manipulating the source of the information, right? Because I'm sort of thinking about like a Randy Calvert-esque type of framework wherein I interpret the smear of socialism coming from a far right politician like Marjorie Taylor Greene very differently than I would from a centrist right wing. Sort of I see a farther right candidate is sort of babbling and they're calling everyone a socialist, whereas there's actually meaningful variation in more centrist candidates. And so if you were to manipulate that and you see differences in voter reactions to that, that would, to me, be consistent with an informational story and not so much the framing story. So that would be, I think that could be very interesting, and you could maybe leverage some things in the US context to do that in a follow-on study. So anyway, that was my one hopefully useful thought. I'll turn it back over to Alon and Avishay if you guys want to take a moment to respond, and then we've got about 15 minutes before we need to call it quits, so we'll have an open discussion for the rest of our time.
Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful engagement with the paper. I can't tell you how great it feels to be the recipient of such generous comments. So I'd like to begin with that. And it's also great to hear what you found interesting about the paper, because there's this process, we've all gone through it. You start off with an intuition or with a question. It's what's driving you, but then the process of finding the answer takes you in other places, and the process of writing itself does something and presenting does something. So in all of this, we might get lost. So hearing what you find interesting, both about the dichotomous nature or the non-dichotomous nature of violence and nonviolence, and the novelty of who is most moved by cueing or labeling and framing is interesting. And like, even to us, this idea that we should think about the center as this distinct category. We see a lot of talk about polarization between right and left, and the independents are sort of an afterthought. So hearing that this resonates with people is great. I'd like to say something quickly, not in way of a rebuttal. I don't think a rebuttal is the right frame of mind, but kind of pushing back and seeing whether you find the pushback convincing. Daniel, to your point on the 1 to 10 scale, and Noam and Brad, to your point about, is this a smear? Is this adding information in terrorism? On the 1 to 10 scale, we were asking ourselves a similar question, though not perhaps quite as sharply, about what is it that we learn when we give people the 1 to 10 scale about, is this terrorism? Is this even a natural way to think about, a way that makes sense to think about this question? And two things stood out to us. So the first is, if you collapse this, let's say, to an even cruder scale of high, middle, and low, would you classify this as terrorism? Then what you end up getting, there are some papers who've done this on other kinds of violence per se. What you end up getting is that the results in Israel all fall, basically, for violence and nonviolence, fall in the high category. Does this tell us more or less? when we do this. Like in a way, this is great for us. We could just say it all falls in the high part of the category, the scale. But it feels sort of disingenuous to us. Maybe disingenuous is too strong a word, but there's a way in which we fear that this might seem sensational, and this is why we were kind of cautious about it. And I'd be curious to hear, Daniel, whether you think this is a good way to push forward by fudging up the scale. And I say fudging not in a derogatory sense, but kind of, stepping back and zooming out like the Magic Eye books and what you see when you lose focus of the small details. So this is one concern that we have, and I'm curious to hear what you think about it. Noam, to your point, and Brad, to yours about what information is being added, perhaps when the word terrorism is used. Is this more information? Is this merely a smear and put any negative adjective there, and you would get the same kind of result? First, my worry is, aren't those two things kind of in tension with each other? So the idea that this is merely a smear and any negative word would do doesn't sit quite right for me with the thought that this is adding information. Because if we are adding information, then it's not just any negative word would do. It's this specific negative word. And this kind of brings us to the question of what are the stakes of calling something terrorism? And the thought of thinking about this in the context of securitization and post 9/11, I think is helpful here, because the word terrorism has come to be associated with specific policy proposals. And here, let's use the analogy to socialism. There's a big difference between calling something socialism when McCarthy is running his hearings versus calling something socialism in the 1990s or the 2000s. The stakes are much higher when there's an ongoing policy effect to the term. And we see this in the Israeli context. The use of the word terrorism. So 6 Palestinian human rights organizations were classified in October last year. Oh my God, how time flies. As terrorist, aiding and abetting terrorism organizations as such. And recently, towards the final days of the previous Israeli government, a major news channel ran a poll asking whether people think of the government as supportive of terrorism, whatever that means. But I do think that the word terrorism is an information carrier, and as such, it's a meaningful label. And we could and probably should go around asking about other negative adjectives, and maybe choose some that are they're mean, the way my 7-year-old described certain politicians. But I think there is a difference when there's a specific policy legal implication. Josh and Connor touch on that in their paper. There is more on that in the securitization and the war on terror literature, but the stakes are real in this case. In which case, I think, yes, it's information carrying, and I think that's why it's useful to use that term, if that makes sense. I'd be curious again to hear in the open discussion sense what the part of the talk what you guys think about these answers. Get over to you, Alon.
Yeah, no, I won't. I don't think I'll add much, both because I'm interested in the conversation, I think, more than my own responses. I'll just say again, thank you so much. And I think a lot of these comments are really thought provoking, especially on framing and follow up, and maybe turning it into either a research. I mean, it's fine. Again, like you said, Noam, it's the opposite recommendation, but both are intriguing, and we need to think this through. It's funny that the American audience always raises this partisan discourse in the US as equivalent. Shows you something, because Israel was always this like case that's up there, and now it's apparently American partisan discourse is exactly up there with it. But we put something in it in the end. We kind of nod our heads at that, but the idea of what does it do when you call someone fascist over and over again in the US? I think that's a really interesting follow-up research, probably for a different paper though. But I don't have a really meaningfully important comment. These are great. great comments that we'll think them through, but I'd be happy to discuss what Avishay raised. And I will mention, maybe I'll ask one question following on what Avishay said. And so if you do see a distinction between information and just a smear label, do you have any ideas of how you would differentiate the two in terms of just empirical design? Because presumably this might lead to very similar outcomes. So if you have any thoughts on how to gauge that difference, I think that'd be interesting to think through.
All right, we'll open up the floor. Any responses to that?
I'm happy to start off and say, Avishay, I really liked your comment about like the scale and what it's trying to do. I think that if you do run it again, one way that you can kind of maybe gauge or get a little bit more information is just before you ask the scale question, like ask a dichotomous question with, is this terrorism? Yes, no, right? Like just put it on like get that and then do the scale question so that like you can, like when you're forcing people into a position, I don't know. I think that there's a couple of ways to kind of I think that your justification at the end of the day does make sense to me. Like I think that that's fair in terms of and the only thing that I would say in that comment is just like put that into the paper as well and make the reader understand what the thought process was more fully in doing that and what the like costs and benefits of doing it in this way were, right? And again, just thinking at this about this from a reviewer perspective, I think that that's definitely something that stands out to me. And so doing a little bit more work on why and giving a more full explanation of what this is designed to do, and then testing a bunch of different ways, if possible, just to like relieve any kind of concerns that the reviewer might have. But again, that's just like that's the nitty-gritty of the review process, and I don't think that it fundamentally hurts the paper, but I think that if you did a little bit more heavy lifting on the front end of why you're choosing to do it that way and bringing in those justifications, it'll make it easier for the reviewer to like not be so defensive or make it that thing that he wants to tank the paper on. That's on.
I guess I can, I'll say something about the label information versus smear sort of thing. I guess what I would suggest if I were sort of following up is to test this against some other salient negative, sort of agreed upon negative label. Because I think for this to work and for the perception of terrorism to be playing a theoretical role, it has to be the case that it's not simply saying this is really bad. Because if all it's doing is it's just saying, well, this is a really bad thing. By the way, they're doing this thing and it's a really bad thing. You should really dislike it. Then it's just like everything else, right? And those things are salient in some contexts and not in others, as Avishay said, but it in some sense is kind of interchangeable with the way that other labels get used, right? Jihadi, Taliban, right? I mean, all of those ways that those terms get thrown at political opponents or outgroups in order to get sort of the negative valence. So, I would think of something like that and try that, sort of a sort of, interaction of the experiment with a different kind of label. And then to the extent that the terrorism label is doing something different, then I think, that's the piece that you say, this really has to do with how people perceive, this particular type of behavior. Action, I guess.
So on the information point, I think to me it raises another question, which is if it is providing information, what is it providing information about, right? And it seems like there's two categories, right? It could be providing information about the actual act that is being labeled as terrorism, but it could also be providing information about the preferences and motivations of the elite that's making the statement, right? Those two seem different to me. And I don't have an answer about how you could experimentally get at that difference, but I think settling the question of, is this about information or something else, requires you to confront, well, what is it that elite queue is providing information about? And I mean, one thing you could, just ask voters, like when you see something like this, how do you interpret it, right? Do you interpret it as, well, the politician has some information that I don't about the nature of the act that they can't tell me, but that they're trying to signal that it's much worse, right? Or are they telling me this is going to be a priority, right, for me moving forward? I think this is serious, that I'm going to spend my time working on this when I'm in office. I don't have an answer to which one of those it is, but it seems like those are the two categories. And I think the sort of the dynamics of how politicians would, signal is going to be different depending on which one of those kinds of information is being provided.
Yeah, that's great. It makes me think that if we do a follow-up, like a research 3 or something, maybe we can, someone suggested, insert back we purposefully didn't mention the politics. We tried to, that's another comment that's it's more complicated in Israel than in the US. A lot of, again, American readers go into because it's not dichotomous in Israel. You can't just say, yeah, liberal, Democrat or Republican. We did, having read the paper, that, but we asked people what they think the ideological position of the speaker is. There's a robustness, and added it, and we see it doesn't change the results. But we personally tried to not put that in. Also, Israel is this perpetual election cycle for a long while now, so it inserts a lot of everything is salient all the time, as if we're but maybe we can at least wait this election out. There's one in 10 days, and might be another one 3 months later, but we'll try to wait it out, and maybe we can think more about the role of politicians, and so we can put the information in, and also so that's a really great direction, I think.
I think that for you guys, at least, with what you have right now, right, you can punt on, make explicit and punt on these questions in the conclusion and be like, but that's, I think that's something that you guys need to decide for yourselves on. How big of a direction do you want to keep pursuing with this? And if this is not something that you feel like you're going to be putting a lot of work and time into, then you need to figure out what the product is and punt on those questions. And if you are going to make it a bigger project, they want to put more time and resources. And this is always the hard point, in a paper, and that's why I also made the suggestion of going in the no direction. I think that if you want to slim it down, get it out, not have to do this anymore, not pursue this as a broader agenda, then putting it all in a package of a note and saying, this is the main finding, this is how we did it, and going that way would be really, but if you do have the time and you do have the focus and the effort, then there's a slew of questions that come out of the study that just are really intriguing to me. This is one of the worlds that I play in, and I think that there's a lot of room still within these to keep going, not just as bring it up, do another study. And I think that Noam's suggestion of study 1, study 2, study 3, instead of folding the American study as a robustness check, will magnify the paper. But I think that with just the two of them, it's not enough of a product to be able to sell as a full paper. And so so the only question is, do you want to keep working on this? Do you want to spend more time, money, and effort into making this bigger, and then slicing out the research agenda that comes out of it, like the source effects? And I'll tell you, just as a personal note, the BJPS paper that I have with Pierce Edwards, Violence on Many Sides, is one of those papers where we didn't know where we were going next, and we ended up going down the source route, but in a completely different direction, right? Because that was one of the main questions that came up for us when we ran that study. Is this a source effect kind of question? And we pursued the source effect question, and it took us 2 years, and we did it in a completely different setting. And so there's just all of the like it's just a question of, and it's you two need to decide on whether you want to contain this as a singular idea or whether this is a research agenda that you want to explore. But I think that it's very clear from the set of questions that you're getting here that there is a research agenda here, and it's just a question of whether you're going to pursue it or you're going to let other people pursue it in the future. And that's just a co-author's discussion that they they need to have that we really can't contribute too much to. But yeah, that's my 2 cents at least of going through this process and starting off from like a public opinion paper and trying to figure out where the agenda is there.
So we're at time. So I want to give Alon and Avishay, if you have any last last lingering thoughts, like if you two a chance to address those, and then we'll conclude.
Just another thank you for me, for everybody, for all involved, Jennifer, the organizers, the respondents. Thank you all very much.
Everything Avishay said, I'm signing on. This is, again, I want to say a great initiative, and being outside the US, I'm extremely excited by everything, all these inclusive initiatives that allow the community to be broader than just geographical boundaries. I think that's really great.
Well, thanks for that, and thanks to you both for sharing your work with us. Thanks Noam and Daniel for taking time and giving really great substantive comments. So we'll draw to a close with that. So everyone, we hope to see you. So first, I hope to see everyone in Denver in a couple of weeks at the Peace Science meeting. And after that, our next session of the online Peace Science Colloquium will be on November 11th at 2 p.m. Central Time. We're going to have Anna Maria Prati from WashU giving a presentation of Can International Interventions Build States? Evidence from the UN Development Program. If anyone in the audience has additional comments, please send them along to Alon and Avishay. And until next time, take care.